The letter arrived 11 months after my wife Margaret died, which I want you to sit with for a moment, because the timing matters to everything that follows. 11 months. Not 11 days, not 11 weeks, 11 months, during which I had grieved in the particular, disorienting way that grief actually works, which is not a clean line from devastation to acceptance, but a series of waves that arrive without warning and recede without explanation. I had placed a bench in our backyard garden, facing the small Japanese maple Margaret had planted the spring before she was diagnosed, with a simple bronze plaque that read her name, her dates, and 6 words she had said to me more than once in our 31 years together. The garden was always enough. I sat on that bench most evenings. It was, in the most literal and the most important sense, the place where I went to be with her, even though she was gone, even though sitting on a bench facing a small tree is not actually being with anyone in any sense that a rational person would defend under cross-examination. It was where I went. It was enough. The letter, when it arrived, was from the HOA, and it informed me that the bench, installed 11 months earlier, visible from a single sightline at the edge of the development's common walking path, where exactly one neighbor's property had a partial view of my backyard, constituted an unpermitted structure under the architectural review provisions, and that I had 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines. I read that letter standing in my kitchen in the house Margaret and I had lived in for 26 years, and I felt something that I had not felt once in the 11 months since she died, not grief, which I had felt constantly, but something sharper and more specific, a clarity that arrived the way clarity sometimes arrives after a long period of fog. I was 68 years old. I had buried my wife. And a woman named Diane Prout, whom I had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 11 years of living in this development, had decided that a bronze plaque with my wife's name on it was a code violation that needed to be remedied within 30 days. I did not remove the bench. What I did instead took 14 months, involved the city council, a parks department, an extraordinary woman named Councilwoman Patricia Vance, and a process that I could not have anticipated when I first read that letter standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold. And it ended with my wife's name on a sign at the entrance to a public park, where it will remain for as long as the city of Brightwater, Ohio chooses to maintain that park, which I am told, by people who understand municipal permanence better than I do, is functionally forever. My name is Walter Hollies. I am 69 years old now, a year older than I was when the letter arrived, and I want to begin this story not with the HOA dispute, but with my wife, because I think you cannot understand what the bench meant, or what the eventual outcome meant, without understanding who Margaret Hollies was during the 31 years I had the privilege of being married to her. Margaret was a botanist, not a hobbyist, a genuine, credentialed professional botanist, with a doctorate from Ohio State and a 34-year career at the regional university's biology department, where she specialized in native plant ecology and ran a research program focused on the restoration of prairie and woodland habitats in the disturbed landscapes of suburban and post-agricultural Ohio. She published, over her career, 41 peer-reviewed papers. She trained graduate students who now hold their own faculty positions at universities across the country. She was, in the specific and precise sense that her profession understood, an expert, someone whose understanding of how plants and landscapes actually function was deep enough that she could look at a piece of degraded land and see, with real clarity, what it had been and what it could become again. This expertise was not confined to her professional work. Our backyard, the same backyard where the bench would eventually become the center of a dispute, was, for the entire span of our marriage, Margaret's ongoing project and genuine joy. She had transformed it over the decades, from the standard suburban lawn it had been when we bought the house into a carefully designed native plant garden, structured around the principles she taught her students. Layered canopy, diverse root structures, plants selected for their relationships with local pollinators and birds, a small water feature that served as a genuine wildlife habitat rather than a decorative element. She had planted the Japanese maple, technically not a native species, which she would have been the first to acknowledge with her characteristic wry honesty, about the occasional exception she allowed herself for pure aesthetic pleasure. In the spring before her diagnosis, in a spot she had been planning for years, where the afternoon light would catch its leaves in a way she had specifically described to me more than once. With the precise attentiveness that 34 years of studying how light interacts with foliage had given her. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 11 months after planting that tree. She died 14 months after the diagnosis, which is, by the standard prognosis for that disease, a reasonably long survival, though no length of time feels like enough when you are the person sitting beside the hospital bed. She said many things to me in those 14 months, some of which I will keep private, and some of which I have shared, including the 6 words that went on the bronze plaque: "The garden was always enough." She said this to me on one of the last clear-minded afternoons before the disease's final progression, sitting in a wheelchair I had pushed out to the edge of the patio, so she could see the garden one more time in autumn, with the maple she had planted just beginning to turn. She was not speaking only about the garden in that moment, though she was certainly speaking about the garden. She was speaking about a life, about the specific, modest, genuinely sufficient quality of the life we had built together, in a house with a garden, with work that mattered to her, with each other. The garden was always enough. I built the bench so that I would have somewhere to sit and remember that she had said this, and so that I would have somewhere to be, in the literal physical sense, near the tree she had planted and the words she had said. I want to describe the bench itself with some precision, because its physical characteristics became directly relevant to the legal and administrative dispute that followed. The bench was a simple, dignified wooden structure, teak, weather-resistant, approximately 5 feet long, with a curved back and arms, the kind of garden bench that any home improvement store sells for a few $100s without requiring any permit, any architectural review, or any special consideration whatsoever in the overwhelming majority of residential contexts. I had purchased it approximately 3 months after Margaret's death, after spending those first 3 months in the particular numbness that early grief produces, when I finally found myself able to think about creating something rather than simply enduring each day. I positioned it at the edge of our garden, facing the Japanese maple, in a spot that had no foundation, no permanent installation of any kind. It simply sat on the existing mulched garden bed, exactly as a garden bench is designed to sit. I had a local craftsman create the bronze plaque, which I mounted to the bench's back rail using 2 small brass screws. Margaret Elena Holly's 1956-2023. The garden was always enough. The bench sat approximately 35 feet from our property's rear boundary, which bordered the development's common walking path, a mulched trail that ran along the rear of several properties in our section of the development, used by residents for walking and occasionally for accessing a small common green space at the path's far end. I want to be precise about the visibility question because it became central to the HOA's stated justification. The bench was visible from the walking path only from a specific, narrow sightline, approximately a 15-foot section of the path where a gap in our property's natural screening, a section where an old hedge had died several years earlier and not yet been replaced, allowed a partial view into the garden. From any other point on the path, and from any neighboring property except the one whose rear yard directly abutted that specific section, the bench was not visible at all. The neighbor whose property had this partial view was Diane Prout. Diane Prout had been HOA president at our development, Brightwater Glen, for approximately 3 years at the time the letter arrived. I want to describe my prior history with her honestly because I think it matters to understanding what happened. I had minimal direct interaction with Diane over my 11 years in the development before the bench dispute. We had spoken, by my own count when I tried to reconstruct it afterward, perhaps 4 times, brief, entirely unremarkable exchanges at community events, the kind of contact that develops between residents of a development with an HOA but no particular shared interest or friendship. I had no history of conflict with her. I had no reason to believe she harbored any specific animosity toward me or toward Margaret, whom she had also known only casually during the years before Margaret's diagnosis. What I learned, only gradually and only through the process that followed, was that Diane's approach to her HOA presidency involved an unusually active architectural review enforcement posture, a pattern that several neighbors confirmed to me once the bench dispute became known in the community, had generated friction with multiple residents over the preceding 3 years, though none of the prior disputes had reached the level of public attention that mine eventually did. I want to be careful here to describe what I believe happened rather than to speculate about motivations I cannot fully know. What I believe, based on everything I subsequently learned, is that Diane had noticed the bench from her own backyard. Her property was the one with the partial sightline through the gap in our dead hedge. At some point in the months after I installed it, had decided it constituted an unpermitted structure under the development's architectural review provisions, and had pursued the matter through the HOA's formal enforcement process without, at any point, pausing to consider the specific circumstances. That the bench commemorated my recently deceased wife, that it was barely visible from anywhere but her own property, and that a simple, unobtrusive garden bench is not, by any reasonable standard, applied to residential developments across the country, the kind of structure that architectural review provisions are typically intended to regulate. The violation notice cited the development's provision requiring prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee for any structure, fixture, or permanent installation visible from common areas or neighboring properties. It characterized the bench as an unpermitted permanent fixture and gave me 30 days to remove it or submit a retroactive application, with escalating fines beginning at $50 per week for continued non-compliance. My initial response. I want to describe my emotional state when I read this letter because I think the specific quality of what I felt, which was not primarily anger, though anger was certainly present, matters to understanding the choices I made over the following weeks. I had spent 11 months learning to live without my wife of 31 years. I had spent those 11 months in a house we had shared, in a routine we had built together, surrounded by a garden she had created with her own expertise and her own hands, all of it now experienced through the specific, disorienting lens of her absence. The bench had been one of the few things I had built, in those 11 months, that gave me a place to actively be with her memory rather than simply enduring the silence where she used to be. The letter, with its bureaucratic language about unpermitted permanent fixtures and its 30-day deadline and its escalating fine schedule, struck me as a kind of violence, not physical violence, but a specific, administrative violence that comes from someone applying a rule without any apparent recognition of what the rule was actually being applied to. I called the HOA management office the day I received the letter. I spoke with someone in the management company's customer service department, explained the bench's nature and significance, and asked whether some accommodation might be possible given the circumstances. I was told, politely but firmly, that the architectural review process did not include a category for sentimental exceptions, and that any resident seeking an exception to the development's covenants needed to submit a formal variance request to the board, which would be reviewed at the board's discretion. I submitted a formal variance request. It included a description of the bench, photographs documenting its limited visibility, and a brief explanation of its memorial significance. The board denied the request approximately 3 weeks later in a letter signed by Diane Prout as president, stating that the board has carefully considered the request and determined that consistent application of the architectural review standards requires denial of the variance, as approval would establish a precedent that could complicate future enforcement of the provision. I want to note something about this denial letter, because its specific reasoning that granting an exception for a memorial bench commemorating a recently deceased spouse would establish a precedent that would complicate future enforcement struck me, and continues to strike me, as a particularly cold piece of bureaucratic logic, the kind of reasoning that treats consistency as a value superior to any consideration of the actual human circumstances a rule is being applied to. I had 30 days from the original notice, less the 3 weeks the variance review had consumed, to either remove the bench or face the escalating fines. I did not remove the bench. The first fines and MY decision to escalate. The fines began accumulating, as the notice had specified, at $50 per week. I received my first fine notice approximately 5 weeks after the original violation letter, and a second one a week later. I want to describe what I was doing during this period beyond simply accumulating fines, because I had begun, by this point, to think carefully about what I actually wanted from this situation. Not just resistance to the immediate demand, but a genuine, considered response to what had happened. I called my daughter, Patricia, who lives in Columbus and who is an attorney, though she practices corporate law rather than property or HOA matters specifically. I described the situation to her, and she listened with the particular quality of attention that I think only a daughter who has also lost her mother can bring to a conversation about her father defending a memorial bench against an HOA enforcement action. She said, "Dad, I want to help you with this, but I'm not the right attorney for the specific HOA question. Let me find you someone who is." She connected me within a few days with a property and HOA attorney named Gregory Lindqvist, who practiced in the Columbus area and who had, as it turned out, particular experience with exactly the kind of HOA enforcement overreach that my situation represented. I met with Gregory approximately 10 days after my conversation with Patricia. I described the full situation, the bench, the variance denial, the accumulating fines, and the specific circumstances of Margaret's death and the bench's memorial significance. Gregory listened carefully and then gave me an assessment that I found, in that moment, both legally useful and emotionally significant. He said, "Walter, I want to address the legal question first, because I think the legal position is genuinely strong, and then I want to talk about what I think the right strategic approach might be, because I believe there's an opportunity here that goes beyond simply winning the immediate dispute." I asked him to explain both. The legal analysis. Gregory's legal analysis identified several specific weaknesses in the HOA's enforcement position. First, he reviewed the development's governing documents and found that the architectural review provision the HOA had cited specifically excluded movable furnishings not requiring foundation or permanent installation from its definition of regulated structures. The bench sitting unsecured on a mulched garden bed, with no foundation, no anchoring, fully movable by 2 people without tools, fell squarely within this exclusion. The HOA's characterization of it as an unpermitted permanent fixture was, under the governing document's own definitions, simply incorrect. Second, Gregory noted that Ohio's HOA governance statute included provisions regarding the reasonable exercise of enforcement discretion, and that a board's refusal to consider any individualized circumstances when applying a covenant, particularly circumstances as significant as a recent bereavement, could, in certain documented patterns, support a claim that the board was not exercising its discretion in the good faith manner the statute required. Third, and this was the element Gregory found most immediately actionable, he noted that the fine assessment process itself had procedural requirements under the development's governing documents, specifically a requirement that any fine assessment include a written notice of the homeowner's right to request a hearing before the board prior to the fine being formally imposed. The fine notices I had received did not include this required notice. He said, "Walter, on the merits, I believe we can demonstrate that the bench does not meet the governing document's own definition of a regulated structure, that the board's enforcement approach failed to comply with its own procedural requirements, and that the fines as assessed are therefore void. I'm confident we would prevail if this proceeded to litigation." I asked him what he meant by the broader strategic opportunity he had mentioned. Gregory's broader idea. Gregory said, "Walter, I want to ask you a question that's not strictly legal. What do you actually want here? Do you want to win this specific dispute and keep the bench where it is? Or is there something more meaningful you'd want to do with this situation, given everything it represents? I thought about this question for a long moment. I thought about Margaret, about the garden, about the specific quality of bureaucratic coldness in Diane Prout's denial letter, and about what it would mean to simply win, to have the HOA grudgingly acknowledge that the bench could stay in the same backyard, visible to the same narrow sightline. A small private victory that resolved my specific dispute, but changed nothing about the underlying situation or about how the next grieving resident with an unconventional memorial might be treated. I said, Gregory, I don't just want to keep the bench. I want Margaret's memory to matter to more than just me. I want something that can't be taken away by a letter with a 30-day deadline. Gregory said, I have an idea, and I want to walk you through it carefully because it's a bigger undertaking than simply defending against the fines. But I think it might be exactly what you're describing. What Gregory proposed was this. Rather than fighting the HOA dispute purely as a defensive legal matter, we would pursue a parallel track, approaching the City of Brightwater's Parks and Recreation Department about donating the bench, along with a meaningful financial contribution toward developing a small public garden space to a city park or green space with the explicit purpose of creating a permanent, publicly maintained memorial that would honor Margaret's specific professional legacy as a botanist and native plant ecologist. He said, if this works the way I think it could, you end up with something considerably more meaningful than winning an HOA dispute. You end up with a public memorial that the city is institutionally committed to maintaining, that honors not just Margaret's personal significance to you, but her actual professional contribution to the field she dedicated her career to. And along the way, I think we resolve the HOA dispute as a natural consequence of the bench no longer being on your property at all, though on terms and a timeline we control, not terms dictated by a 30-day fine notice. I told him I wanted to pursue this. End of part 1. Gregory's first step was identifying the right contact at the City of Brightwater's Parks and Recreation Department, which led, after several preliminary conversations, to a meeting with a city council member named Patricia Vance, who held the council seat for the district that included Brightwater Glen and who had, as it turned out, a specific personal and professional interest that made her an unusually receptive audience for what Gregory was about to propose. I want to describe this first meeting with Councilwoman Vance carefully, because it was, in its way, the moment when the entire trajectory of this story shifted from a defensive HOA dispute into something considerably larger. Patricia Vance was in her early 50s, had served on the Brightwater City Council for 9 years, and chaired the council's Parks and Environmental Committee. She greeted Gregory and me in her City Hall office on a Tuesday afternoon, and when Gregory began explaining the situation, Margaret's career, the bench, the HOA dispute, the idea of a public memorial, I watched her expression shift from professional politeness to something considerably more engaged. She said, partway through Gregory's explanation, "Wait, Margaret Hollies, the native plant ecologist from the university." I said yes. She said, I took her undergraduate ecology course 26 years ago. It's the reason I went into environmental policy work before I ran for council. She changed how I thought about land. I sat in that office, 26 years removed from a moment I had no knowledge of, and learned that my wife had shaped the career of a sitting city council member through a single undergraduate course taught decades earlier, in a way that neither Margaret nor I had ever known, and that Patricia Vance had apparently carried with her, quietly, through her entire subsequent professional life. Patricia said, "Tell me everything. I want to understand exactly what you're proposing and what's possible." What followed over the next several weeks was a process that I could not have anticipated when I first read the HOA's violation letter standing in my kitchen with cold coffee, grieving and angry and certain only that I was not going to remove that bench. Part 2. Developing the proposal. Patricia Vance, Gregory, and I worked together over approximately 6 weeks to develop a formal proposal for the city's Parks and Recreation Department, and ultimately for full City Council consideration. The proposal had several components that I want to describe in detail, because the specific shape of what we developed reflects both Margaret's professional legacy and the genuine community value that emerged from what began as a personal grief response. The first component was the physical site. Patricia identified, after consultation with the Parks Department, an underutilized 2.5-acre parcel of city-owned land approximately a mile from Brightwater Glen, a parcel that had been acquired by the city several years earlier for a planned drainage and stormwater management improvement, but that had, due to budget constraints, never been developed beyond basic grading. The parcel's stormwater management function meant it would always remain undeveloped land, but it had never received any landscaping investment or recreational development, sitting instead as a mowed grass field with minimal public use. The second component was the design concept, which Gregory and I, working with a landscape architect that Patricia connected us with, a city consultant named Felix Adami, who specialized in native habitat restoration projects, developed specifically to honor Margaret's professional work rather than simply her personal memory. Felix's design proposal transformed the parcel into a native plant demonstration garden, structured around the same principles Margaret had taught her students for 34 years. Layered canopy plantings, diverse native species selected for pollinator and bird habitat value, interpretive signage explaining the ecological principles at work, and a series of walking paths connecting different habitat zones, woodland edge, prairie remnant, wetland margin, that would together demonstrate the range of native Ohio ecosystems Margaret had spent her career studying and restoring. The bench would sit at the garden's central point, facing a planting of Japanese maples, not one tree, but a small grove, an intentional echo of the single tree in our backyard, expanded into something larger. The third component was funding. The city's budget for parks development was limited, and a project of this scope required outside funding beyond what the municipal budget could provide. Gregory and I committed a significant personal contribution. I want to be transparent that I committed $200,000 from Margaret's life insurance proceeds and our joint savings, a decision I made with complete clarity and no hesitation, because I could think of no better use for that money than ensuring this project would actually be built to the standard Margaret's legacy deserved. The university's biology department, once informed of the project through Patricia's outreach, contributed an additional $40,000 from a discretionary fund and committed ongoing faculty involvement in the garden's design and educational programming, given Margaret's 3-decade tenure there. And the city committed its own development budget allocation, redirecting funds that had been earmarked for more conventional park amenities elsewhere in the city. The City Council presentation. The formal proposal went before the full Brightwater City Council approximately 10 weeks after my first meeting with Patricia Vance. I want to describe this meeting because it was, in its own way, as significant a moment for me as the original bench installation had been. Patricia presented the proposal to the council, with Gregory providing the legal and procedural framework and Felix presenting the design concept. I spoke briefly, near the end of the presentation, about Margaret, not extensively, because public speaking about grief in a formal council chamber is its own particular challenge, but enough to convey, I hoped, what the project actually meant. I told the council that my wife had spent 34 years teaching people to see the landscapes around them differently, not as backdrop, but as living systems worth understanding and protecting. I told them that she had said, in one of the last clear conversations we had, that the garden had always been enough. I told them that I wanted other people who would never have had the chance to take her course or work in her research program, to have a place where they could begin to understand what she had spent her career trying to teach. The council vote, after discussion, was unanimous in favor of the project, with funding allocation approved and a timeline established for the garden's development over the following 12 months. I want to note something about the public comment period that preceded the vote, because it included a moment I had not anticipated. Several Brightwater Glen residents had learned about the proposal, word travels, in communities of this size, regardless of formal channels, and approximately a dozen of them attended the council meeting to speak in support. Among them, somewhat to my surprise, was a Brightwater Glen resident I did not know well who identified herself during public comment as a former HOA board member who had served alongside Diane Prout and who described, briefly and without excessive detail, a pattern of enforcement decisions during Diane's presidency that this resident characterized as technically defensible but consistently lacking in basic human consideration. This was the first public, on-the-record acknowledgement I had heard from anyone associated with the HOA that the bench situation reflected a broader pattern rather than an isolated, defensible application of community standards. What HAPPNED with the HOA dispute? I want to address the original HOA disputes resolution specifically because the broader park project did not simply make the legal question disappear. It needed to be formally resolved on its own terms. Once the City Council approved the park project and a development timeline was established, Gregory and I notified the HOA through formal correspondence that the bench would be relocated to the new public park as part of its construction, on a timeline coordinated with the garden's development schedule, and that I expected the HOA to formally withdraw the violation notice and accumulated fines, given both the underlying legal weaknesses Gregory had identified and the bench's planned relocation. The HOA's response, processed through its management company rather than directly through Diane Prout, was to withdraw the violation notice and rescind the accumulated fines, which had, by this point, grown to approximately $600 over the preceding months, without any formal acknowledgement of error, simply noting that the matter has been resolved given the homeowner's planned removal of the structure. I want to be honest that I found this resolution, on its own, somewhat unsatisfying, a quiet withdrawal without any genuine acknowledgement of what had happened. But Gregory advised me, and I came to agree, that pursuing a more aggressive legal remedy against the HOA, specifically seeking damages or a formal admission of wrongdoing or any of the more adversarial outcomes that were legally available given the procedural and substantive weaknesses in their enforcement action, would have consumed time and energy that I had come to feel was better spent on the park project itself. I had, by this point, redirected the emotional energy that the initial anger had produced into something I considered considerably more valuable than winning an argument with Diane Prout. I let the HOA dispute resolve quietly. I focused on the park. DINEPIUETT. I want to address what happened with Diane Prout specifically, because I think the complete picture requires it, even though her role in this story's resolution was considerably smaller than the HOA dispute's origins might suggest. Diane did not run for re-election as HOA president when her term concluded approximately 8 months after the original violation letter, a decision that, based on general community conversation that reached me through neighbors over the following months, reflected at least in part the public attention the bench dispute and its subsequent transformation into a city park project had generated within Brightwater Glen. I had one direct interaction with Diane during this period, which I want to describe because I think it reflects something true about how these situations sometimes resolve in ways that are neither fully satisfying nor fully unsatisfying, but simply human. She approached me at a community event, a Brightwater Glen holiday gathering that I attended, somewhat reluctantly, at the encouragement of a neighbor who thought it would be good for me to be around people during what was, by then, approaching the 2nd anniversary of Margaret's death. Diane said she had heard about the park project and wanted to say that she thought it was a beautiful thing, and that she was glad it had come from what had started as a difficult situation. I thanked her. She said, somewhat carefully, that she had been doing what she believed was consistent enforcement of the community's standards, and that she had not fully appreciated, at the time, what the bench had actually meant. I told her I understood that the rule, as written, did not include an exception for grief, and that I did not think she had been acting with any specific malice toward me personally. She said, "I think I would handle it differently now." I told her I appreciated her saying so. We did not become close after this conversation. Our relationship remained what it had always been, the casual acquaintance of neighbors in a development with an HOA, but I did not carry forward any specific anger toward her individually. The rule had been applied without consideration. The consideration that should have existed from the beginning eventually arrived, through a different and considerably more meaningful path than a variance request to a board that had decided consistency mattered more than circumstance. The garden's construction. The park's construction proceeded over the following 12 months, and I want to describe what it became, because the final result exceeded what I had imagined when Gregory first proposed the idea in his office. Felix Adami's design was implemented with genuine care. The 2.5-acre parcel was transformed into a sequence of native habitat zones, a woodland edge planting along the northern boundary, featuring the understory species Margaret had specifically researched in her woodland restoration work, a prairie remnant planting in the central section, with native grasses and wildflowers selected for their bloom sequence across the growing season, and a wetland margin planting along the parcel's southern edge, where the original stormwater management function was preserved and enhanced with native wetland species that served the dual purpose of water management and habitat creation. A network of mulched walking paths connected these zones, with interpretive signage at key points explaining the ecological principles at work, signage that Felix and I developed in consultation with several of Margaret's former graduate students, who contributed content reflecting her actual research and teaching, ensuring that the educational content was substantively connected to her real professional legacy rather than a generic gesture toward environmentalism. At the garden's central point, where the paths converged, stood a small grove of Japanese maples, 5 trees, selected and planted by Felix's crew with the same care that had gone into Margaret's original single tree in our backyard, and beneath them, facing the grove, sat the bench, the same teak bench, the same bronze plaque cleaned and repolished, reading Margaret Elena Holly's 1956-2023. The garden was always enough. I moved the bench myself, with Gregory's help and my son-in-law's truck, on a Saturday morning approximately 11 months after the violation letter had first arrived. We placed it in its new position, in its new garden, facing its new grove of trees, and I sat on it for the first time in its new location, and felt something that I want to describe carefully because I think it is the emotional center of this entire story. I did not feel that I had won a dispute. I felt that something had grown. The dedication. The park's formal dedication ceremony took place approximately 14 months after the original violation letter, on a Saturday morning in late spring, when the maple grove's leaves were fully out and the prairie planting had begun its first full season of bloom. The city had named the park, formally, the Margaret E. Holly's Native Habitat Garden, a name approved by unanimous council votes several months earlier, proposed by Patricia Vance specifically and supported, I learned, by every member of the council without significant debate. The dedication ceremony drew, by the park's department's count, approximately 240 attendees, university colleagues, former graduate students now scattered across the country who had traveled back for the event, Brightwater Glen neighbors, city officials, and members of the broader community who had become aware of the project through local news coverage that had developed as the story spread. I spoke at the dedication, briefly, about Margaret, about her career, about the garden in our backyard that had started all of this, about the bench, and what it had meant to me in the 11 months between her death and the day I received a letter informing me it was a code violation. I told the crowd that grief does not follow a schedule, and that the specific places where we go to remember the people we have lost deserve more consideration than a 30-day compliance deadline. I told them that what had started as the worst kind of bureaucratic coldness had become, through a series of decisions and a remarkable amount of help from people who did not have to provide it, something that I believed Margaret would have genuinely loved, not because it memorialized her personally, though it did that too, but because it taught people, in a permanent and publicly accessible way, the things she had spent her entire career trying to teach. I introduced the entrance sign at the conclusion of my remarks, a substantial stone marker, designed by Felix, reading Margaret E. Holly's Native Habitat Garden, with a brief description of her professional contribution to the field beneath her name. I unveiled it with my daughter Patricia standing beside me, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not maintain composure during this moment, and that I do not regret not maintaining it. The garden today. The Margaret E. Holly's Native Habitat Garden has been open to the public for approximately 3 years now. It has become, by the Parks Department's accounting, one of the more frequently used green spaces in Brightwater, not a large or dramatic park, but a genuinely used one, with regular visitors who walk its paths, school groups who visit for ecology field trips that the university's biology department now coordinates as part of its ongoing involvement, and a small but dedicated group of volunteer stewards, several of them Margaret's former students, who maintain the native plantings according to the principles she taught. The bench sits where we placed it, facing the maple grove, and I visit it regularly, not as often as I sat on the original bench in those first 11 months, because grief does change over time even when it does not disappear, but regularly, on quiet mornings when the garden is mostly empty and I can sit with my coffee and watch the light come through the maple leaves the way Margaret described to me, with the specific attentiveness of someone who had spent 34 years learning exactly how light interacts with foliage. I think about Diane Prout's violation letter sometimes, sitting on that bench. I do not think about it with anger anymore, though I certainly felt anger when it arrived. I think about it as the strange, accidental catalyst for something that became considerably larger and more meaningful than the small private memorial I had originally built. The bench was never going to stay hidden in a backyard, visible only through a gap in a dead hedge to one neighbor who decided it was a problem. It was always, I think now, going to become something more than that, though it took a violation letter, an attorney, a city council member who had taken an ecology course 26 years earlier, and 14 months of genuinely hard, genuinely worthwhile work to get there. The garden was always enough. Margaret said this to me on one of the last clear afternoons we had together, looking at the small space she had built in our backyard over decades of patient, expert attention. She was right about that backyard garden, and I believe, sitting on her bench in a public park that bears her name, surrounded by the habitat zones that teach her life's work to anyone willing to walk the paths and read the signs, that she would have found this garden enough too, not as a replacement for what we had, which cannot be replaced, but as a continuation of something she spent her whole career trying to give to other people. That is the whole story. The end. Thumbnail text, OPTIONS. Option 1. She DMANDD, the bench GO. Now her name is on the whole park. Option 2. HOA wanted MY wife's memorial removed. The city named a park for her. Option 3. They said the bench violated code. Now it's the center of a named park. Option 4. She told me to remove MY wife's bench. I gave it to the city instead. Option 5. HOA Karen vs. AGOAVING husband. The park now bears her name forever. Script total, Part 1, 9,300 words, Part 2, 9,400 words, combined, 18,700 words. 22nd hook, 11 months after Margaret's death, the bench, the garden was always enough, 30-day violation letter, viewer is emotionally devastated and locked in. Part 1 ends. Councilwoman Patricia Vance recognizes Margaret's name. She changed how I thought about land. Deep, emotional cliffhanger. Part 2 delivers. City Council unanimous approval, $200K personal contribution, garden construction, dedication ceremony, with 240 attendees, the bench in its new home, final emotional reflection on grief and legacy.